I'm going to jump right into it because I'm really excited about, this panel today. I'm going to let the panelists, we got Jordan Pascal from he's a transportation reporter from WAMU, Scott Broaddeck. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Broaddeck.
You want to meet your stuff? He's a founder and CEO of Local News Now. And we have Kaya Wilson, senior editor of Streets Blog, USA. So are my folks here, are my panelists here? Can y'all unmute?
Yep. Hi.
Hey.
Nice to meet you. It's Kia Wilson, just as a heads up for folks.
Boom. Boom. Jordan, are you here?
Yeah, good to see everyone.
Everyone. Scott, are you here?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're okay.
All right.
So we're going to jump right into it. With the first question. Well, first thing, this panel you will hear from experienced transportation journalists who are on the front lines covering our issues. The panelists will speak to how government agencies, advocates, and residents can collaborate with transportation journalists, and you will get an opportunity to ask questions of our seasoned panelists. And you will also hear how they go about covering issues on the ground and how they go about developing that angle when they're pursuing stories. So this is awesome, y'all. I'm really excited about this one. Let's kick it off. So the first question we got: what's been a reoccurring issue you run into when communicating with government agencies or advocates when covering transportation issues? And so I'm going to mix it up a little bit in the order, but first I'm going to start with you, Scott.
Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk today. This is an issue I think that is very important. I'm local news through and through, and as far as local issues go, this is, in my view, one of the biggest. So I'd say that there are. I went on a Twitter thread a few weeks ago, which is probably what brought me here today. And what the point I was trying to make was that I think that there is a lack of detail and emotion in the reporting of what could be termed traffic violence. I don't particularly love that term, at least in writing news stories, but I'll use it here today to broadly talk, say what we're talking about. And what I find out is that government PIOs, so people, police and fire, at least in my world, and I suspect elsewhere, they have really kind of gone towards a just the known facts stance, where if we're asking about something that happened, and most of the reporting on crashes is going to happen in the immediate aftermath, not afterwards, like Jordan's fine story the other day. There's very little information to get, and it's very, emotionally detached. Someone has non-life-threatening injuries, someone has life-threatening injuries. I won't say what those injuries are, just that they're, and non-life-threatening, we reported on a bicycle crash the other day. They're not actually sure what crashed into what, but he had non-life-threatening injuries, but they were debilitating injuries that could, be with him for the rest of his life. And so there's just such a range covered in that. And when we ask for additional detail, we don't get it. So it makes it very difficult from our perspective to report on crashes in a way that I think resonates with an audience. Because this issue, large change does not happen in this country without a real movement behind it, a mass movement, people deciding we've had enough of this. And they decide that not based on logic, they base stuff like that largely on emotion. And so if the reporting on crashes does not spark emotion in people, they're not going to be inclined to want to make sacrifices in their daily lives of how they drive or, otherwise, that could lead to, improve this situation, which you can call it an epidemic, but in my local reporting, and I have the scanner on most today, just there's so many times where people are getting struck by, mostly by drivers. And, you chalk up all the maladies in local life, and this has to be one of the biggest. So I think that the government, folks in government can do a better job of providing additional details. Now, I recognize there are constraints they're under. They don't want to get stuff wrong. HIPAA has everybody scared to talk about anything specific when it comes to injuries. And it's a tough job. Being a PIO is a tough job, getting woken up at 2 a.m. to provide information is not fun. So I will recognize those constraints. That said, it was better before, at least from my perspective. And so I think maybe we can go back to being a little looser and a little less CYA. I think some of this is CYA behavior, what that stands for. So I would like to see a return to a little more detail on the government side. I feel like I'm not monopolizing the time on this. I have more to say, but I'll hand it off to the other panelists.
Throw it over to you, Kay.
Thanks so much, Jeremiah. So just to tell you all a little bit about me, my name is Kia Wilson, and I work for an advocacy journalism outfit called Streetsblog USA, covering issues of traffic violence. I actually use that word a lot in my particular line of work, so I totally appreciate why the local journalists on the panel would shy away from that. And the movement to end car dependence nationally. So I'm not a local journalist, but I do interface a lot with government agencies in specific regions like the DC region, who have experienced in particular crashes, but also positive transportation developments, exciting things that are happening in the DC area. Unfortunately, a lot of what I cover are crashes. And a recurring issue that I experience a lot when talking to government agencies is just a lack of response, frankly. And on top of that, a lack of readily available aggregate data to contextualize those individual crashes, those individual events within broader trends. There are some really fantastic government agencies across the country that are doing a great job of putting together what we call Vision Zero dashboards that say not just this is the crash that happened today, here's the details that Scott was talking about that we really need to know in order to make the human stakes of this problem clear, but also this is the percentage of crashes that happened on high volume arterials. This is the percentage of crashes that involved a hit and run driver. The systemic recurring causes that start to paint the picture of this is a problem, not just of this particular tragedy, but of the system overall that needs to be changed. Advocates play a really big role in getting that message out. I often get way more information from groups like WABA and other bicycle and pedestrian advocacies in particular are tracking this stuff much more closely and in much more detail than the law enforcement officers and other things like that. But I think the biggest thing I would point to is a need for understanding the systemic and structural drivers of these crashes and of the positive things that happen in your transportation community in real time and specifically to your region, because I know what the trends are nationally. I write 4 to 5 articles a week. I don't know necessarily always what they are where you are. So that's where I'd start us off with.
Awesome, thank you, Kia. As well as thank you, Scott. Throwing it over to you, Jordan. The question was, what's been a recurring issue you have run into when communicating with government agencies or advocates covering issues?
Yeah, I'll definitely second both what Scott and Kia had to say. Transparency, I think for the most part, I think could be improved. DC does a great job with the Vision Zero dashboard. There's some other agencies that do a really good job, but I think one of the most frustrating things about covering a news cycle is, a council introduces something new and, oh, we're gonna reduce speed limits, we're gonna stop right on red, and it's harder to quantify how those things are doing. Is it fixing the problem? Is it not fixing the problem? I think, like for instance, a couple of years ago, I think maybe 2019, I covered what's called left turn hardening, where you see those like kind of yellow bollards and the kind of, not in an intersection, but as you're turning left, there's like these bollards that kind of are aimed to slow people down and make it safe for pedestrians. So I did this, great story on, DDOT's putting in all of these things, but a year or two later, you see all of these things mowed down by vehicles. So, I would love to hear more kind of thoughtful analysis from DOTs or Vision Zero directors. What is having a really good impact? What's not working as well? Where can we improve? I know a couple jurisdictions have these coordinators, but I would love to see them out in front saying, here's what's working great. Here's what we need to work on. Here's the challenges I'm facing, because covering Vision Zero is frustrating, and I'm sure it's frustrating for officials, seeing, this uptick in trends, but, it's not for a lack of trying. But I would be really curious to hear kind of more transparent evaluation of how they think certain programs are going.
Could I come back to the activist part? I talked about the government part. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine. You can go ahead.
All right. So I'm going to put my Otto Hightower hat on right here, provide some uncomfortable truths as I see it that are also a little self-interested. So there are two things that I see from the activist standpoint. Look, I largely agree that providing agency to there's a lot of language policing right now, especially on Twitter, around the articles written about crashes. And I largely agree with the part about assigning more agency to drivers and just not using the impersonal vehicle in every every sentence of a story. But just because that is a thing to do doesn't mean that it can be done throughout the story and in every headline. There seems to be a belief among some activists on Twitter that like a headline is in fact just a entire summary of a story, and that's not really how headlines work. And I can tell you, journalists are people, and we are famously very active on Twitter. And when we receive what we view as unfair criticism on Twitter about our writing, it does not have a positive effect. So there have been some stories where we've really gone out, gone out on a limb to report things because of just a total lack of information. There was a recent fatal crash involving a kid on a scooter in Alexandria, where there was just not a lot of detail, and we kind of put two sides of that story together, where it was like it was one of those situations where you're like 99.8 or 9% sure, but you can't be 100% sure because no one's verifying that connection for you. And we got dinged, even though the lead of our story, references being struck by a driver. It was like, someone cherry picked like one part of it that they didn't like, and said, do better. And we got all this hate. And that's just really frustrating, I will say. I mean, poor us. But for those in the audience, I will just say that I don't view as helping the cause here. And the other thing I'll say here is that, if those on the activist side want to look at ways that they can help with, the reporting on such things, it's very difficult for us as reporters to get in touch with victims, as Jordan did, for his story, because we largely do not want to be ambulance chasers trying to talk to people who are injured, in the back of an ambulance. And that's generally frowned upon, especially these days. But I think telling those stories is important to put a human face on what's happening out there and to provide more detail about the actual effects of these crashes. So, on the activist side, maybe there's an opportunity here to establish, a victims network or something where, those who want to are encouraged to put their story out there more frequently, rather than the like once a year we get it during a Street Smart campaign. Or I think, Jordan, you might have talked to a group that helped put you in touch with people. But to have those stories out there more frequently rather than just once a year, I think would be a good opportunity here. And it's very tough for us to do that ourselves, especially in local with a resource constrained environment. So if the activists are able to do that, I think that could have a positive effect and result in more good journalism on this topic.
Thank you, Scott. So this next question, I'm gonna throw it over to Jordan and Kia. First for you, Kia. The question, kind of like what Scott just answered there. How can government agencies, advocates, or residents communicate better with writers, journalists while covering these issues? So that's kind of what we're here for. You know, they want to hear how can they work or communicate better with you.
Sure. So that's a two-parter. I'm going to take advocates first. So I am in a unique position because I am an advocacy journalist, and I don't have to be, I can be pretty transparent about my biases, frankly. But so I've done some advocacy in my own community to make sure that my local journalists know that I'm a person they can call to connect with sources, to connect with local details, in addition to my bike fit advocacy and all that kind of stuff. We put together a one sheet here where I live in St. Louis, Missouri, by the way, to basically say, hey, if you can't track down, or for the many reasons that Scott, I think, rightly pointed out, you don't think it's wise to track down a victim's family, here is the local victims advocacy and survivor advocacy group that can talk to you about the human cost of these tragedies, even though you don't necessarily have the voice of the specific victim's family, right? I'm someone who, like, I don't like to be quoted as often, but I can connect you to people who their whole job is to be quoted on these issues, and they're happy to, and they're speaking on these issues nationally, and they also have been briefed locally by me in some cases. Make yourself available to your local journalists. Though that said, I will underscore that while I am not a local journalist, I've read enough research on the structural sort of restraints on what y'all are dealing with, and it's really tough. A lot of crash reporting in particular, since that seems to be the theme we're focusing on today, is done by like reporters who are on the civics desk for maybe a year. They have very, very little time to put it together. So I think this is where we start turning towards government agencies. There's a really fantastic study that I'm going to leave in the chat when I'm done talking, that basically sought to get police officers to write better press releases after their crashes. Because frankly, at the end of the day, a lot of journalists are really just working off of that press release, and they don't have the resources to look much further beyond it. So how can we get police to start talking about not just, you know, a car hit a person and then they sped away? You know, in St. Louis, our crash reports are like, they're like coded. There aren't even words on them. It's just like a few numerical codes that usually don't paint the picture clearly at all. So how can we get them to talk about things like how many lanes were on the road? How can we refer it out to how many crashes happen on super wide lanes, and start underscoring the role of road design? So I think government agencies can play a really big role in using templates like the one developed by Tara Goddard and Kelsey Ralph, that I'm going to put in the chat right after I'm done talking. And making the extra effort to make sure that they are not talking about these things in isolation, and not using language that is harmful, like accident instead of crash, which in many cases is emblazoned across the top of, you know, your crash portal in your city. In St. Louis, it certainly is. So those are just a few examples.
Awesome, thank you, Jordan. One of the reasons why folks are in the audience, they want to learn how can they work better with you? How can the folks who work for government here today, or the advocates, how can they work better with you?
Yeah, I think couple thoughts, and hopefully I can keep them all together. One of them is letting us know you're here before we need you. Jeremiah, we've worked on multiple stories, issues. There's some folks in the chat, Christy Kwan with DC Families for Safe Streets, Helena with the Trauma Survivors Group at GW Hospital. And so, I mean, reaching out even when there's not something going on is super helpful. The story that I did, I talked to 5 people that were affected by traffic violence, either hit or killed, or, you know, family members of those that were killed. And, you know, finding sources for stuff like this it can be difficult. We reached out to a couple different groups. I reached out to individuals that I had covered kind of the aftermath of a crash or a vigil or something like that. Not everyone wants to talk to a journalist, and I totally appreciate that. It is traumatic. It is tough to relive. probably the worst moment of your life. So, having that group that is kind of the connector is always really helpful because there's a comfortability level there. One of the things I talked to fantastic people who were great interviews and were really honest and raw with their stories, and I appreciate that. But I had a group from Montgomery County reach out, and I was maybe tangentially aware, but I wish I would have reached out to them as well, because they're saying in our area, it's a Hispanic population that is really affected by these crashes, or low income areas. So had I known that ahead of time, I would have tried to work in a lot more of that stuff. Sometimes you're running up against a clock. Your editor's like, you've got a lot of other stories to work on, like, we got to wrap this thing. So a lot of times the stories aren't perfect, but yeah, the really kind of building that relationship early, coffee, whatever, just to kind of kind of get on people's radars, I think is really helpful. And I had one other thought, but I can't remember it. But yeah, thanks.
My next question is, this is something I guess we all kind of wonder, and I think I kind of answered this a little bit, but like we want to know, how do you find your stories? Like, I know I know folks mentioned, talking to families who have been victims of traffic violence, there's police reports. Here, I know you're like nationwide, so like there's a lot out there. It's a lot to cover. When we open up the news in the morning, we see like a big list of all the things that are happening in the region and are happening in the country. So how do you say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to cover? So how do you find your stories? And I'm gonna throw it over to you, Scott. How do you find your stories?
Yeah, so in our case, yeah, a lot of it comes off the police scanner, police and fire radio. So that's something we have on. I come from a TV background. I worked at Channel 4 and Channel 5 here in town before I started this site about 12 years ago. And by way of introduction, for those who are unaware, so I'm the owner publisher of ARL Now, FFX Now, and ALX Now, which cover Alexandria, Fairfax County, and Arlington, Northern Virginia. So we from day one, because I'm used to it from my TV background, have had a scanner on most hours of the working day. And if we didn't have that, like if you just went on press releases alone, you'd think that there were only a handful of crashes in Arlington County each year. The fact of the matter is, it's a daily occurrence. It's not daily that people are seriously injured, like very seriously injured, but it's a regular occurrence, and that's sort of given me the visibility as a journalist into just the scope of the problem here. So I'd say that anytime it might be a topic that doesn't seem that interesting, but if you hear of jurisdictions around the country that are working to encrypt their police radio channels, that is going to be detrimental to the cause of better reporting on crashes, because that's where a lot of journalists, especially on the TV side, but also on the website, hear about this stuff. And then the other thing, the other place we get information is through tips. Tips are very helpful, and I'm not really in contact with any group in Arlington that I'm aware of that's really putting out information on victims and saying, hey, here's someone who could talk, and here's more details about what actually happened. That might be an opportunity. I'd say that some groups here in the DC area are very district focused, but it's a big place, and there are big problems in Northern Virginia and suburban Maryland. And so, maybe zoom out on that scope a little bit. And one last thing I'll say in terms of insight into the reporting process is that, we journalists are not time travelers. Like we do not have perfect information about something that happened after it occurred. We rely on the reason why, police and fire officials play such a big role here is because we would largely rely on them to give us information that is, some degree of what actually happened. We can try to get out to the scene and talk to witnesses. That's unreliable and hard to do, and we can't go to every crash. We can, hope that someone sends us information eventually, but you can't rely on that. And even then, you don't know, the quality of the information. And a couple of days after a crash, if you're just getting basic information on it, it's probably past its expiration date. So having good information earlier on and then filled in with more details from groups that are able to provide it, I think would be very helpful.
Jordan, how do you find your stories? I think one question, you can feel free to answer it in the midst of your answer. We got a question from Helena. She said, "What makes an injury serious in journalism?" So we're wondering, like, what makes something serious enough to cover?
Yeah, I want to build on Scott's point for a second. That is so important. Like WMU is regional, and if we cover just fatality deaths alone in the region, it's 300 among, I think it's 26 jurisdictions in our region. And so we cannot, and there's, I think, 10 reporters that are supposed to cover the entire facet of the region. And so we've really struggled with how to cover individual crashes, even individual fatalities, which we don't get to everything nowadays because the sheer amount of them, 300 last year. And so we're trying to figure out different ways to basically, find other angles. Do we cover, when community gets involved and there's rallies and that sort of stuff, that skews coverage one way as well. But so, the story that I did talking to survivors was one of those ways that we tried to get at the issue in a different way. And I hope it kind of, got to the issue a little bit, but so yeah, it's really difficult to know when and how to jump in on these things. So, it is easier, I think, if I focused a little bit more on DC, just because that's where I live and that's kind of the nucleus. But Scott's right. I mean, Fairfax, Moco, Prince George's County. Prince George's County accounts for like a third of the region's fatalities. So, it's hard. There's one of me, and I'm also covering Metro and bike lanes, and there's a million issues out there. So, I mean, we could have a reporter dedicated just to traffic violence, and they would still have a full-time job. In terms of Helena's question, with what makes injuries serious, I mean, that is that's one of the things that we like. The reason we don't cover a lot of individual crashes right after they happen, for a lot of the reasons Scott mentioned, is it's just difficult to get good information early, and a full picture and everything. And so we don't often get into the serious and non-serious and that sort of stuff. But I mean, my thinking of it is, I mean, almost every crash is serious, whether you're gonna talk about injuries or not. I mean, the people I talked to skewed on really, really awful, life-changing injuries. But I mean, I was on 1A earlier today, our national current event show, and people talked about just minor fender benders and how that affected them. So I think serious really kind of skews how people think about that. And I do, getting back to the language thing, unfortunately, a lot of people only read headlines, and so I think if you get kind of this repeated exposure to kind of the pedestrian hit by car mantra, I think it kind of changes the way people think about what happened. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
Awesome, thank you, Jordan. Yeah, how do you go about finding your stories? Because I'm pretty sure you get emails from people saying, "Please cover this or cover that."
yeah, and that's. Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry, Keith. Oh, I was just gonna say quickly,
Yeah.
that does happen, and we can't get to everyone, and so I do always try to keep people, have chats with people, you keep them in mind for kind of larger future stories, that sort of thing. But Twitter, a lot of Twitter, a lot of what's in the kind of zeitgeist. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, so it seems like there's kind of two questions here. One is how I find my stories, and one is how I select my stories, which for a little more background, I am the only reporter full-time at Streets Blog USA. We have affiliates that we're like syndicating things from. I work with freelancers and things like that sometimes, but primarily it's a one-woman show. So this is a particularly big challenge for me. How I find them, I'm also very reliant on tips. I'm very reliant on aggregators. You know, Jeff Wood's The Overhead Wire is really important for me, especially finding like academic things and big stories in other outlets that I want to sort of get an advocate's take on it and get a sort of different framing on it. In terms of how I select stories, though, it's much more challenging when you're talking. Basically, what I'm doing as an advocacy journalist is every time a story crosses my desk, I'm asking myself what I want my audience to do with the information that I might write about that story actively to advance our mission, which is ending car dependence in the United States and ending car crash deaths and serious injuries in the United States. So when I'm reporting on a local story, what I have to do is think through, and ideally the tipster would help me think this through. This is also good advice on how to tip national journalists, in my space at least, is like, how is this emblematic of a larger trend? How is this going to inspire someone who doesn't live in this region to do something in their region? So an example would be, I recently reported a little bit on the death of Sarah Langenkamp in your region, and her husband was incredibly outspoken with all kinds of journalists in your region and nationally about her death and the way that systemic causes contributed to it. She died in a painted bike lane, which is a problem all over the United States. She was killed by the driver of a commercial truck, which had very, very poor visibility. Those are all over American roads, and there's been a lot of legislation to try to enhance visibility standards for those vehicles that have failed, frankly. There are issues of national importance that folks all over the country, you know, they can imagine themselves, their loved ones dying in this way if they haven't experienced that already. So it's always this question of how can I extrapolate this out while also holding on to, at the core of it, what makes the story unique and human to this individual person. Sarah Langenkamp's story was really, really moving in a lot of ways. She, her husband really made the case that she is a national hero who our country is like worse off for having lost her. She was a diplomat in Kiev that really helped the Ukrainian military fend off the Russians. So there was a lot of human interest in that story. There's human interest in all of these stories, though, to be clear. The question is, how do you frame it in a way that's going to advance the objectives of larger movements, at least when you're talking to an advocacy journalist?
Absolutely. Okay, we're gonna stay with you real quick. So one question we had, well, one thing we want to hear is like, what is the most exciting part of your job? And let's say, like, what's the least exciting part of your job?
Wow, the adjective exciting is challenging for me. Most exciting is I'm a giant dork for this stuff, and I just get to kind of like muck around in things that I think are really important. Transportation, we've talked a lot about the really, really violent parts of the transportation beat for a lot of this call, but it touches on a lot of things that are very hopeful too. It touches everything about American life at the end of the day. And it signifies some pretty important political forces in the way that we live. And so I really love this beat. I've never really worked on another one, frankly. I worked on like urbanism more broadly in a previous position. But yeah, I think this stuff, there's a real opportunity. I see a real opportunity in taking a topic that we think is kind of bland and boring as a culture, like infrastructure, concrete, and making it as emotional and dramatic and like intense as it frankly is, if you think about it for even a minute when you scratch the surface. The least exciting part, I don't know if I would say the word exciting, the thing I like the least about my job is like the constant exposure to trauma. It's not great. I have to be honest about that. It's really punishing to talk constantly about, you know, as I think Jordan said beautifully earlier, the worst day in many people's lives ever, again and again. And I'm not desensitized to it, and I don't think I ever will be, because this is an issue that is getting worse. It is an issue that is affects far more than just the person who it was involved in the crash, it ripples out through communities. And unlike other forms of violent deaths, it is frequently erased very quickly, both physically from our roads and also from narratives about violence more broadly. And that's a challenging space to live in. It's why I do what I do, but it also, the reality of the apathy is hard to live with, I have to be honest.
Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it. Scott, what is the most exciting thing about covering?
For us for a minute there, but I'll just take the same question you asked before. I don't know if I would necessarily use the word exciting, but what I will say is that I've always had a passion for covering breaking news in the moment. When I was a kid, I would have a scanner on at my parents' house and would ride my bike to go check out things in our little suburb that were happening. You know, if someone had a fire in their kitchen or whatever. So I've always had an interest in that, and so listening to the scanner, covering significant incidents in our area is something that I find rewarding, and I think that the benefit of that is that doing that kind of coverage is communicating the scope of what's happening out there. I think if you didn't, we're at the front lines of local, where we're reporting on an individual community that's a subset of a larger metro area. And so this is sort of like the first building block of what goes into local news, and news more broadly. And so it's kind of incumbent on those of us at that level to provide a accurate, I think, reflection of what's actually happening in the community and the crashes, even though we mostly report on those that are significant, to use that term. I see the benefit in doing that reporting, just from letting the public know, hey, this stuff's actually happening, where you live. In terms of the least exciting, I'll say it's a frustration. It's a frustration with not being able to get all of the information that I want to report. And, it's especially frustrating when readers also express, why didn't you ask about this? Well, we either did ask about it and didn't get an answer on it, or we didn't ask about it because there was no one to ask, or we knew we would get nothing. If it was up to me, we'd be reporting every single detail there is to report. But unfortunately, that's not the reality of what we're working with. And we have to report the facts as they're known. We'll go to make the extra effort to get more. And, I've made the point about talking about the victims and who they are and what their actual injuries are. We do that to the extent possible, but it's difficult. And it's also, I'll add this as a 1B to the least exciting, having to deal with people who are, suffering some sort of a trauma, who are the victim of something, and trying to talk to them is the least, probably the least favorite part of a lot of journalists' jobs, because you kind of have to do it if you want to tell the story you want to tell, but at the same time, a lot of people don't want to talk, and they think that you're kind of an asshole for trying to talk to them.
Thank you, Scott.
Not everybody, but a lot of people.
Same with you, Jordan. What's the most rewarding part of your job, and what would you say the least thing that you don't want to deal with sometimes, but you have to?
Yeah, I think the exciting part is that, I think about other beats that we have is, education or certain, jurisdiction or something, and that's going to appeal to a certain segment of the audience. I feel like transportation is one of those that connects everyone everywhere. Unless you never leave your house, you're going to be affected by transportation at some point. So I find that aspect really exciting. The least exciting thing is, I agree with Kia, is just it is for victims, I mean, they're telling us what they're feeling, and that is 100-fold what we're I think some of that trauma is taxing on journalists, but I mean, I don't want to complain about that because I'm not experiencing that personally. But I do think empathy and trying to absorb or understand or feel a little bit of that is kind of part of what you have to do to kind of communicate, their story. And that does take a little bit of, a little bit of tax. It can be heavy. And when I was working on that story that was speaking with victims, and there was a few times that it took way longer than I wanted to. I think I started in April and it came out in August. It took a lot longer than I wanted to, but sometimes I had to take a break and just say, "Whew, this is a lot for them," and kind of was a lot for me at times. So it's a necessary part of the work, I think, though.
We got a lot of folks I know are really interested in this next question. Word uses. Some words you tried. What are some words you try to avoid using when covering transportation issues? What are some words you try to use more of? So I'm trying to frame the question. I know we have a couple of comments in the audience about words to use, words not to use, words that are misleading. It is a very, very touchy thing and a very important thing to advocates on the ground when it comes to covering transportation issues. And so, Jordan, let's stick with you. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on words you try or words.
Yeah, back my first job was breaking news in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I will never forget the first time someone sent me. I think it's crash.accident or crash.accident.com, I think, if I remember right. But it's a specific website that kind of lays out why we shouldn't be calling things accidents, and that really kind of changed my thinking a little bit. I mean, there's a number of decisions that go into using the words that we do. AP style is one of them. That kind of is Associated Press style is kind of one of the overarching things that journalists use. And so sometimes that will dictate word choice. Sometimes it's editor's word choice. Sometimes it's organizational. I mean, I think the Post kind of gets criticized a lot for the, and I'm trying to think of the way they do it, the pedestrian hit by vehicle, that sort of wording. I try to use more active language. I'm not 100% sure why organizations use that. If it's still going that way, there's probably a reason. But so kind of that active language is really important of like, okay, what happened? And, those early reports, sometimes it's really hard to know exactly, what happened, because you are relying on police narrative. And, they kind of use that passive language, and I'm not sure if it's for legal reasons or investigations take a long time. There's a lot there. So that's kind of some of the stuff that I think about. But yeah, I mean, we've really shied away from writing about individual crashes because of the difficulty at times.
So Scott, what are some words you try to avoid when doing your reporting?
So, I absolutely agree that it should be crash, not accident. So nothing too original to say there, but I will say that accident is, probably common vernacular. Majority of people, if you see, two vehicles that just crashed into each other and ask them what happened, and they'll say, "Oh, it was an accident." And so what does that mean for those who employ journalists? Well, it's easy to conceptually think as, as someone who just consumes the news that, oh, why isn't the Washington Post, doing it this way? Well, the Washington Post is hundreds of people. It's an organization. And so if you have hundreds of people and their kind of first instinct as humans is to use one word, you need to train them not to use the other, on what to do there. Now, a lot of journalists, like myself included, Jordan mentioned this, we get training by doing. It's one of those kind of professions. So, pointing out that crash is a better word than accident in Twitter, I'd say that's probably, a positive thing, and informing people about that. Especially if they're a younger career journalist, doing so in a non-judgmental way would probably be good, a good approach. But yeah, organizations need to have training regimens, and I will regularly remind people if I see the word accident, like, please make that crash. But that's not something that just happens automatically. So just know that these are organizations and humans, and the way that you overcome some of these wording issues is not as easy as it seems.
And Scott, I think it's in the vernacular. We've said it that way for decades, and so that's the way people first think to write something,
Right.
and it takes change.
I agree. Sorry to just kind of jump on there, but I do think that it is really, really important. And I say this from a perch of someone who is very steeped in a certain sort of advocacy language, that journalists get on board with some of these best practices guidelines, because there are a lot out there. They aren't as hard to implement as they might be, though I totally sympathize with the fact that they take some training and some time. I'm going to leave some links in the chat in just a second, that there have been studies that have shown that uses of words like accident instead of crash, non-agentative language, which is like a driver hit or a car hit a person rather than the driver of a car hit a person, or to give sort of another example, like a gun shot a man versus a person shot another person. Those have a real measurable effect on how people allocate blame. And the way that we view blame within police departments, there actually isn't a lot of like legal grounds for using non-agentative language. And like, I think police fear, I've seen some research that police fear that they will be like brought up on libel charges if they use that, and there isn't a lot of evidence that they actually would. And I will include some links and sources on that too. But I also want to say that it's not just about individual words, it's also about framing. It's also about what sort of low-hanging fruit you pluck as a journalist. I think it's really important to make sure that we, like, I will never report a story about a cyclist who died and say whether or not they were wearing a helmet. I won't do it, because in a lot of cases, that helmet would not have saved their lives. If a pedestrian dies in a crosswalk versus out of a crosswalk, frankly, I don't care. What I care about is how far that crosswalk was from where they were. Was that crosswalk raised and protected? I go around on like Google Maps on places where I don't live, and I look up speed limits. I like tour around the specific crash site or as close as I can get to it. And I look at the road design features. And I'm not a planner by training, but I've worked with enough planners, and I took the initiative to go out and talk to planners and make sure that I understood the general sort of trends that are predictive of dangerous driving overall. And they're not, once you know them, you kind of know them. Like 75% of pedestrian crashes in particular occur on roads with a certain number of lanes, certain speed limits, certain number of billboards. Like, there are studies and there are resources out there that can point you towards common crash patterns that you can kind of have in your back pocket as a journalist. So I think part of it is language. And I agree with Scott that the debate over driver of a car versus a car hit a person is like very confusing for me personally. And I do think there are some downsides to both uses of the framing, but it's broader than just individual buzzwords. It's really what your core frame is and what like trends you're trying to highlight. So that seeps down to the level of individual language, but it's also saturating the whole article.
If I could add to that briefly, I totally get why WAMU is not reporting on individual crashes. You have limited resources. You're trying to cover an entire, large metropolitan area. But if breaking news and coverage of crashes is seen as sort of a lower form of local journalism, done only, in a haphazard manner by those on the overnight desk at the Post, or, the TV stations, done by, less experienced reporters, you're not going to get as high quality coverage as you do if, someone like, my fellow panelists here cover an issue. So just something to keep in mind, how certain types of news coverage is valued, both by readers and by, organizations, does affect what the ultimate output is. And if you're relying on people who are younger, less experienced, let me erase younger and just say less experienced, because it doesn't matter what age you are, it's how much experience you have in the business and reporting. If you're relying on them to do coverage and they're not getting trained very well, and right now with the state of the industry, training is not exactly a high point, and J schools are a whole nother topic. But yeah, I think that some of the attribution for the state of reporting on such things can probably, in large part, be kind of boiled down to who's being assigned these stories and where.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know someone mentioned in the comments that Jordan, you touched a little bit on how has that shrinking local journalism coverage impacted how these stories are covered. So I believe that was a comment / question, but also I want to couple this with, we may have some writers, future writers, are thinking about pursuing a career in transportation, journalism, reporting. What words do you want to share with them to to give them a little inspiration to jump into this field, starting with you, Jordan?
Yeah, I want to mention what Kia's done is talk to planners, build up an expertise, understand the issue, and start writing. Journalism is changing. We are few and fewer seem to be getting into it, and a lot of people that I've worked with are not in the industry anymore. And so we want to see people step up that maybe don't have the traditional background, but I think having the expertise and the understanding of an issue is almost more important. I mean, you need to know how to write well, but I think building those muscles, understanding of the issue is one of the top things that I would start with.
Kim, what words of advice do you have for our aspiring writers out there?
Well, I am one of the people with a non-traditional background on this call, so I don't know that I have advice besides just that you can do this work without a J school degree. I don't have one. You can do this work, especially if you are someone who is able to make, I would encourage particularly people who are able to make these issues emotional, urgent, and actionable. Those are like the 3 adjectives I try to live by. And it doesn't have to necessarily be through a traditional journalism outfit. Streets Blog has affiliates all over the country. We have had affiliates in DC in the past, in St. Louis in the past, that are no longer active. I think there's a lot to be said for alternative journalism and that is just as rigorously fact-checked and accurately reported as traditional journalism, that makes the case for foregrounding trends that are underreported. If there were no one writing about car crashes, if I weren't writing about car crashes in St. Louis, even occasionally, and other outlets like Next STL, we would not have coverage of this as a trend. People don't know that it's a trend. And that is a pretty profound oversight that I think can be corrected on an individual level. I don't like the word blog, even though blog is in the title of my publication, but blogging, independent publishing has its place, especially if you are able to do this sort of rigorous background research to make sure you know what you're talking about, and you are centering people, particularly people who are less privileged and less listened to, frankly, in your coverage. So that's, I guess, where I would start.
Awesome.
Just to add to that, I'd say know your audience. Who are you trying to reach, and what kind of impact do you ultimately want to have? If you want to reach a specific subset of your audience, maybe it's people who are specifically interested in these kind of matters, then write for them, provide them with something with new information that they want to read. But if your audience if you want to reach a general audience, whether that's locally or whatever, you need to approach it with their information desires and expectations in mind. You can't be writing as if you're writing towards to activists, but expecting a general audience to know what you're talking about. So sometimes you do need to. There's language you want to use that you and everybody else who's very much rooted in this sort of thing would understand, but the average person, like, you know, think about like your mom or your neighbor or whatever, they wouldn't get, and it wouldn't connect with them. So, you know, write in a way and report in a way that's going to connect with the audience you're trying to reach.
Yeah, I would, yeah, and especially and if you're a subject matter expert too, try not to use like we had somebody on air use vehicles miles traveled today, and it's like, okay, planners know what that is. Probably a lot of people in this room know what that is, but the general audience doesn't know what that is. So yeah, definitely don't use jargon or explain it very clearly, but don't use it.
Awesome. We got about 5 minutes left, or just a couple of more minutes left on this panel. My last question, I would love to hear, let's leave it on a good note. Let's leave it on a good note. Let's be forward thinking. What's out there in the near future or down the road that you're really, really excited about, either covering, either exploring, either working with advocates, government agencies, families, regardless of what it is. What's down the road that you are really excited about? And also maybe leave the audience with a story this past year that was really impactful for you. Either something you wrote or either something you read. What was a story this past year that was really impactful for you? And what are you looking forward to down the road on the horizon? So let's start with you, Jordan.
You know, this is kind of my own pessimism at times, but I, you know, just covering the Vision Zero issue often feels like I'm beating my head against a wall because the same things keep happening, the same cycle keeps happening. I've been in DC long enough that I have covered the same things over and over. On the optimistic side, I mean, I hope a lot of these interventions that, you know, government is trying work. You know, it's so frustrating when, you know, individuals control so much of what happens. You know, I would love to see, you know, speed governors, you know, be universal. I would love to see, you know, some of these things that control kind of the individual side. It's America. I don't know if we're going to see that stuff, but the thing that excites me the most is the conversation that's started over the last, I don't know, maybe decade or so, where people, you know, we talked about it on national radio today for an hour, and we talked about the trauma and the psychology and the effects. And I think those conversations hopefully kind of seep in and kind of get more in the zeitgeist, and hopefully that drives more change, more safety. You know, we talk a lot about non-bias in journalism, but I think we can all agree that like not killing people with vehicles or dying in traffic is something we can all agree on. So I'm hoping that conversation continues and grows to the point where we start to really get some systematic changes that kind of fix the issue. And then your other question was a story that we've been proud of or whatever. I'm just going to drop in the link, and hopefully some of you have heard Rebecca Young, who's on this call, was one of the great people that talked to me for this story. And it's 8 or 9 minutes of just people telling what happened when they were hit by a car. And so I hope stories like that really kind of impact people and you know, and think about actions. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan, so much. As usual, appreciate you. Scott, what's been a story this past year that either you wrote or someone else wrote that's really impacted you, that you thought was really good journalism? And what are you most excited about heading down the road?
It's going to sound like a cop-out, but honestly, Jordan's story that I just dropped in was fantastic. There should be stories like that in every city in the US. So, you know, if we see more of that kind of reporting, I think we would all be better off for it. So despite my Twitter thread, which talked about the need for, you know, more emotion in reporting to help people kind of form a movement to help reverse some of these trends in traffic violence, I think I'm more optimistic on balance about technology solving this than changes in human behavior. We have seen it, what certainly seems like more reckless driving recently. You know, you can debate the reasons why. I do think that that's probably cyclical and reverses in some degree, but traffic serious injuries and deaths are not going away unless we, in my view, unless we really perfect the technology around preventing it, because humans are humans. So if I were on the activist side of the equation, maybe I'd try to focus some energy on trying to get Google to use some of the self-driving tech that they've been developing, and maybe make that available to car makers for free on the crash avoidance side, and get more of those kind of systems out there. I can tell you that we have a 2019 vehicle that has forward collision avoidance, and there was a time where I will not say who was driving the car, but there was a near crash into the vehicle in front of us, and totally would have been our fault, and the car stopped. And I do not think it's out of the realm of possibility that we can have tech like that that's preventing more crashes down the road, and maybe pair that with some GPS speed governors, so you can't go 130 miles an hour down in LA street and kill multiple people. So I'll just say I'm optimistic about the direction of technology, and if I were advocating here, I'd be advocating for that kind of stuff to be pulled forward and brought to market more quickly.
Yeah, you got the last word.
Okay.
What's the story this past year that either you wrote or someone else wrote that you were like, this is good journalism? And then what are you most optimistic about going down the road?
Oh, well, I'm not going to flatter myself to be like, this is the best journalism ever, but the story that made me most optimistic to report on was the National Roadway Safety Strategy coming out of US DOT. It is the first time in my lifetime and most of our lifetimes that we have heard transportation officials at the federal level saying that the only acceptable number of road deaths is 0. It is not perfect. I wish it were radical in many ways. I wish Congress were as much behind it as this DOT is, but I have a lot of optimism with the scale of money that's available for street safety interventions, and at least so far with the way that these things are being implemented are really, really promising. And I also want to flag that the safety strategy did a pretty damn good job of highlighting that this is not an issue that impacts all communities equally. It is disproportionately impacting communities of color, communities of low income, unhoused people. And I think as soon as we start reckoning with that and like connecting those dots, which journalists need to do too, and I'm trying very hard to find new ways to do all the time, we're going to see a lot of movement on this. That's what makes me optimistic.
Awesome. Let's give a round of applause. I know I can't see folks, but I'm pretty sure you're giving a round of applause. These folks cover our issues. As you know, they're humans too. Just remember that. They're doing good work out there in the community. I am going to speak for everyone in the audience when we say we really, 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 really appreciate all three of you, and thank y'all so much for being on this panel. And we all look forward to collaborating with you and working with you in the near future. So thank y'all so much again.